Since the Roman occupation, England has mostly been dominated by a power base ruling from the south of the country, principally centred on the great city of London. But the northern regions of England, remote and culturally distinct from the south, were, for much of recorded history, staunchly independent, wildly restless and prone to rebellion. Unhappy with regal rule from a distant southern capital, northerners did, on more than a handful of occasions, rise up in a series of bloody attempts to challenge or replace their kings and queens in the south.
I'm Daniel Gray, and in this series we take a detailed look at the great northern rebellions from the 11th century to the 16th, and how normal folk from areas like Yorkshire, County Durham, Lancashire and Northumberland rose up to bravely challenge the divine authority of their masters, rulers like William the Conqueror, Henry VIII and his daughter, the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth.
The northern rebels felt that this was their time. They had to act fast.
It was now or never.
Time was running out.
We'll see how those rulers responded, often with contempt, savagery and vengeance, in a series of cruel campaigns that laid waste to vast areas of the north and killed hundreds of thousands of people. The human and economic cost of these terrible crusades against the northern citizenry would impact down the centuries.
It was a brutal period of history for the north.
It was said that this campaign killed over 100,000 people.
Although the memory of these events from the 1100s to the 1600s has been widely lost from our collective consciousness, the lasting effects of these upheavals can still be felt even now, in a north that was and continues to be economically poorer than the wealthy south. It could even be said that the north has never really recovered from the onslaught it endured, which laid waste to its agriculture, livestock, infrastructure and economy, devastating lives and stunting development for centuries.
I'll be your guide through the major northern rebellions of the past 1,000 years, taking you to the places at the heart of the struggles and introducing you to the people who sacrificed, fought and often died for the causes of personal and religious freedom in the north.
We'll take a look at how a series of decisive and controversial actions led to a social and political powder keg in the English north, and how and why the match was lit that ignited civil conflict.
And we'll visit the key towns, castles, houses and battlefields of the revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries who fought and died in the northern rebellions. There were uprisings in the north against the Roman authorities throughout the early centuries of the first millennium. But our story begins with the largest insurgency in England for 1,000 years. And it happened right here in the north.
After 400 years of Roman rule, the indigenous people of these islands had melded with the Roman colonists and culture to form Romano-Britons, a new culture with a distinct identity. But the Roman Empire, like all empires before and since, slowly began to expire. When the last Roman legions withdrew from these shores at the beginning of the 5th century AD, the Romano-Britons then had to contend with new waves of visitors, Germanic Anglo-Saxons, who settled large areas and brought new traditions and language. The Anglo-Saxons came to dominate the land, but they were not a strong imperial force like the Romans, so the island was still vulnerable to attack. Ready to take advantage were invading Scandinavian armies, the Vikings, who took control of much of the north and brought a whole new culture and language to the region, leaving a legacy that we can still see and hear today in the distinct accents and place names around Viking northern England.
The Anglo-Saxons were descended from two Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, and they came to the British Isles in the 5th and the 6th centuries.
England was a multicultural, diverse society in which region mattered a great deal.
The Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians established a fractured patchwork of different kingdoms that developed over the centuries. Kingdoms like Wessex and Mercia thrived and grew, whilst Danelaw, the Viking system of government, became dominant in the north. In 937 AD, England finally united under one king, Aethelstan. With his capital at Winchester, far from the culturally distinctive populations of Northumbria, the fledgling state endured rebellions and further waves of attack from the Norsemen, who would raid and sack English ports along the coastline for centuries. But despite many setbacks, the new state ultimately endured. England was ruled by Anglo-Saxon English kings, and an Anglo-Saxon English nobility governed and administered the land.
That all changed on the 14th of October, 1066.
To understand how England and the North was changed forever that day, we must glance across the English Channel to a man looking out upon the water from his castle, a man who had a vision and, most of all, a huge axe to grind.
The Normans are actually descended from Vikings that settled in the northeastern part of France, and they quite quickly established themselves as a very strong military society.
They were self-consciously a conquering people. So they conquered not only Sicily, but also the Holy Land and other regions that required boldness, ruthlessness, courage, and daring.
Culturally, politically, economically, they are very successful.
The Norman leader in 1066 was William, Duke of Normandy.
His father died on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and William became Duke of the Normans at the age probably of 7 or 8.
He'd had a rocky time coming to power and facing massive rebellions.
And he becomes very experienced in military leadership and bureaucracy and statesmanship. So when we get to 1060, that's when he's actually consolidated his rule over the Duchy of Normandy, and he sets his sights on expansion, taking over nearby Maine in 1063, and of course setting his sights on England.
The Norman leader, William the Duke of Normandy, was an able, ambitious warrior leader. He would set England alight and forever alter the course of history.
On the 5th of January 1066, King Edward of England died, leaving no clear heir, and several contenders laid claim to the throne. Edward's immediate successor was the Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson, the richest and most powerful English aristocrat. But Duke William claimed that he'd been promised the throne by King Edward, and that Harold had sworn agreement to this. The stage was set for a vicious confrontation. Duke William assembled a large fleet and army to invade England, remove Harold, and claim the throne which he believed was rightly his.
William wants to be King of England, primarily because it is one of the richest countries in Europe at the time.
The king's power runs from Cornwall right up to Northumberland.
Gaining England would provide him with a huge pool of land, enormous wealth, and the ability to provide land and patronage to his men.
In the 11th century, expanding your kingdom was the thing to do. It sent a very strong message that you were a powerful ruler and you were not to be messed with. And this was an important message for William to send to his enemies, who included the Danes and other French rulers.
William gathers his army from all over Europe. He also starts packing his ships with arms and armour and supplies.
Around 1,000 ships and more than 10,000 men crossed the Channel.
They landed at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex, and they moved inland to Hastings, where they started to build a fortress.
He harries the land around Pevensey and Hastings, because these are the areas in Harold Godwinson's own earldom of Wessex.
This is a calculated move. William would also know that Harold was in the north of England.
Because he had to move up to Yorkshire, marching his troops the whole way.
To face up to the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, and his own brother, Tostig, with whom he'd quarrelled. And he met them in battle at Stamford Bridge, killing both of them.
On the 25th of September, Harold's forces successfully defeated the Danish invasion. But just as he did this, he heard news that William had landed on the south coast, and straight away he had to march his troops all the way back down to the other end of the country.
Harold, a man in a hurry, determined to save his loyal servants from the harrying of William, marches to fight.
After weeks of marching and battle, Harold led his army to meet Duke William's invasion force at Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066.
In a day-long battle lasting from 9 a.m. till the early evening, the superiority of the Norman cavalry and infantry tactics gradually wore down the English defenders.
The Normans were confident that they could achieve success at the Battle of Hastings.
They'd kitted themselves out in all the latest military hardware of the 11th century.
The Anglo-Saxon troops are lined up on the top of Coldback Hill.
And they had axes and spears.
They are used to fighting Danes who also fight on foot. They've chosen the best position at the top of the hill. William of Normandy is at a disadvantage. He's at the bottom of the hill, but he has horsemen. He has cavalry who are trained to fight in groups of 10 with their 9-foot lances at a charge. William's troops, especially the Breton troops, charge up the hill and pretend to retreat.
And they did this to lure the Anglo-Saxons out and to break their lines.
It's one of the fiercest fought battles on English soil.
In the end, we must think of a hard-fought battle, finally decided by superior generalship breaking the English ranks and eventually launching an attack which killed Harold.
When King Harold was killed, apparently shot with an arrow through the eye, his army came into disarray. Duke William was victorious and the King of England lay dead on the battlefield. The Normans had won the day.
One battle does not a conquest make. And after the Battle of Hastings, William needs to secure the crown.
In London, Edgar the Atheling is proclaimed as king, but not crowned. William then marches around the southeast of England, Dover, Canterbury, south of London.
On his 350-mile journey from Hastings to London, he harries the land.
Ravaging the countryside, imposing his will.
And Edgar the Atheling and all the other Earls, Edwin and Morcar, that are in London submit to him.
William was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066, but his conquest was by no means complete.
William set about ruling and shaping his new possession. Some of the lands of the resisting English elite were confiscated and given to Norman nobles. But at first, William desired to use the existing English bureaucracy. It was very useful to him. He installed many English aristocrats to key positions in the regions.
He keeps a lot of the Anglo-Saxon sheriffs in place, and he also allows several of the Anglo-Saxon earls to retain their titles and their lands.
It really was, in some ways, the machinery of Anglo-Saxon government and the centralisation of royal government that almost made it a little bit easier for William to take power.
But not everyone wanted to be a part of Duke William's New England. Many, especially in the north, did not want the Normans here at all, and they were prepared to do anything to get them out.
English resistance to the conquest was centred around Edgar Atheling, a relative of Edward the Confessor, the English king who died in early 1066 prior to Harold coming to the throne. Despite having his own claim to the throne, Edgar initially submitted to William in December 1066, but then reneged on his pledge. Joining with other disgruntled earls, they rebelled against the Norman king.
William marched his army here to York to confront Edgar and his rebels. But when he arrived, the rebel army melted away, with Edgar escaping to Scotland.
In early 1067, William goes back to Normandy, taking with him a lot of money.
And he leaves behind in charge his brother and childhood friend to look after England in his absence. And this is really where the trouble begins.
It is said that they took land, they killed local populace, and that they raped the Anglo-Saxon women. And this caused such ill feeling that in the north of England, we have a rising in 1067.
The rebels in the north were led by Morcar, who was previously the Earl of Northumberland, and he'd been disinherited in 1066. He was also joined by Edwin, Earl of Mercia, who was really angry at William after a promised marriage to William's sister didn't take place. In the north, there had been a lot of trouble since the Norman conquest. There had been 5 successive earls, 2 of whom had been murdered, and people were starting to feel really angry at the changes that William was making. Not only was he taking away Anglo-Saxon land and giving it to his Norman favourites, he was sometimes forcing Anglo-Saxon earls to buy back their land and property in order to stay in favour.
William's wife Matilda's coronation as Queen on Whit Sunday 1068 at Westminster is a major turning point. After this, major English rebellions break out.
The rebellions of 1068 and 1069 saw the uprising of many members of the local population across the north in support of the claim to the throne of Edgar Atheling, descendant of the House of Wessex. And they saw the killing of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of William's men across the north. All of this helped to infuriate William against the local population.
At York, for example, the garrison is expelled from the city. So William's followers, Normans, Bretons, Flemings, are being killed.
In Northumbria, William now appointed Robert de Comines, a loyal Flemish follower, as Earl rather than an Englishman. Robert rode into Durham with a party of men on the 28th of January 1069 to take control.
Robert de Comines enters into the city of Durham, he and his soldiers having pillaged the villages on their journey into Durham. And he is warned by the Bishop of Durham that there are guerrilla fighters in the hills around the city. Robert de Comines takes no notice, but at nightfall, the Anglo-Saxon guerrilla fighters march into the city.
At Durham, Robert de Comines and about 900 of his men are brutally massacred by the people there.
Many of his men were cut down in the streets. Robert took refuge in the house of the Bishop of Durham. The rebels set fire to it, and Robert was burned to death.
Of 900 Norman soldiers that marched into the city of Durham, only 2 managed to make it out alive.
And this really sends a strong message that the Northerners are not happy with the Normans, they do not want a Norman Earl, and they are ready to do anything to defend their rights.
With Durham secure, the rebels then took back York, killing the guard of the castle and many of his men.
William was enraged. His response was swift and brutal. He returned to York, slaughtered many of the besiegers, and retook the castle. Emboldened by the fighting in the north, rebellions now broke out in other parts of the country. England burned with insurrection, and William was forced to crush revolts from the south to the Midlands.
There was very much a sense from William's point of view that his rule was under threat. He rode from one place to the other across the country to put down one rebellion after the next.
This really was the crisis of William's reign, and he knew it.
The problem William has is the Northerners are not meeting him in pitched battle. They were acting like guerrilla fighters, hiding in the hills.
The guerrillas would attack property, set buildings on fire, burn crops, attack Norman troops. It was a very unpredictable time for William, and he was managing rebellions on every front.
Meanwhile, the rebel leader in hiding, Edgar Atheling, had persuaded the King of Denmark to aid his rebellion. The Danes landed and with their English allies retook the city of York. In the winter of 1069, William once again marched his army to York with the intention of engaging the rebel army. But once again, when he arrived, the rebel army had fled, with Edgar returning to Scotland. William, sharp and cunning, then secretly made a deal with the Danes, paying them to return to Denmark without a fight. With the Danes now out of the picture, William knew it was time to find and destroy the rebels. But as they were not prepared to meet his army in pitched battle, William employed a scorched earth strategy aimed at diminishing the rebel army's supplies.
What happened next has been considered by some scholars to be an act of genocide. It has come to be known as the harrying of the North.
So William has to teach the North a lesson. William and his new Norman lords were in charge.
We believe that some of the rebels fled to the high grounds. William was prepared to send troops high up into the Pennines to flush out his enemies.
William knew he had to do something really bold to send a message to the rebels and to also stop any future possible insurgents being able to support themselves.
For the people who'd been leading the rebellion, he's actually trying to capture them and kill them. For the general population, he's aiming at starvation.
William splits his army into smaller units and sends them out across the countryside. They burnt houses and crops, they destroyed livestock. It was meant to leave nothing behind.
We can speculate that troops are given license by their leader to roam free and to do their worst, that this would have brought rape, pillage, killing on a huge scale.
A family might wake in a Yorkshire village to discover a band of Normans approaching, and this would have struck terror into their hearts, knowing that within a couple of hours their entire village would be destroyed.
Women, children, men, the elderly, babies, all were subject to the Norman sword.
It must have been a truly terrible time to live in the north of England.
This probably brought the death by not just killing but by famine of up to 150,000 people.
Refugees were reported as far south as Worcester.
Many people in the north were reduced to eating horses and dogs and even their own dead because they were starving.
The Anglo-Norman historian Orderic Vitalis later wrote about the harrying in stark terms.
The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. To his shame, William made no effort to control his fury, punishing the innocent with the guilty. I have often praised William, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him.
The wretched natives of the north struggled against famine, illness, misery and death. Their rebellion had been extinguished, and William's ruthless, efficient military machine had made the Norman conquest an irreversible fact.
From William's point of view, we can say that the harrying of the north was actually effective. Although it deprived him of potential income from those lands, it did succeed in putting off future rebellions in the north of England and depriving his enemies of economic resources. So in terms of did it achieve what it was supposed to achieve, yes it did.
There is widespread condemnation of William's actions throughout much of Western Europe. Pope Gregory VII actually said that though I am supporting you, there are many who criticise me for supporting a man who has done such terrible things.
William was a very religious man, so there was certainly going to be part of him that regretted what happened in the north and the huge destruction and the death toll that came as a result of that.
And we do have an account from Odoric Vitalis who does say that William did say sorry for the vengeance he had taken.
Years later, in 1086, the Domesday Book records that Yorkshire still had large areas of waste territory. 60% of holdings were waste. 66% of all villages contained wasted manors. It also reported the loss of 80,000 oxen and 150,000 people. Modern scholars are divided on the numbers lost. Some say 100,000 were killed as a result of the harrying, many through starvation, whilst others claim it could be much higher. This figure represents 4.5% of the total population of England at the time, though it is disputed. What is not disputed is that by 1070, the north lay in ruin. William's original plan to work with the English, to use their existing systems of government to rule his land, was dead. After the rebellions had been crushed, he brought in his own followers to govern England, purged many of the English bishops and abbots from the church to be replaced with Norman clergy, and built castles across the kingdom to both secure and subdue local populations.
The Old English aristocracy was gone. William created a new ruling class, a foreign nobility. The English population, scarred by the horror of the harrying, would not rise up to challenge Norman rule ever again.
The harrying of the north helped to establish William's rule in England. As a result, he was able to secure his government and secure his dynasty. He was able to pass the throne on to his sons and secure his line for future generations.
For years afterwards, there were problems with growing crops. Entire villages needed to be rebuilt. It holds back the development of the north for generations.
William died in 1087, but his legacy was enduring. The invading Normans, over time, became natives themselves. Norman kings and their descendants remained in power for centuries. England morphed into something new, a Viking, Anglo-Saxon, English-Norman nation with a mixture of Scandinavian, Germanic and French culture moulding society. The introduction of the Norman language as the language of the elites would also change our linguistic makeup forever. The Northern rebellions had demonstrated the restless nature of the North, but although subdued for now, revolt was not extinguished forever.
In the next episode, we'll see how the North rose up again to face a deadly tyrant. Not a foreign invader, but an English king.
Rebels thought that they had to stop what this government was doing. God was on their side.
It was a savage campaign.
This was a brutal period of history for the North.
And we'll see how that king dealt with his own subjects as ruthlessly as any foreign despot before him.
Between 1069 and 1070, William the Conqueror had harried the north, destroying, killing and laying waste to large areas to put down a rebellion against his rule. But the north was not subdued forever, and in the coming centuries its inhabitants would rise up many times in defiance of its southern masters.
1214 saw the launch of a major rebellion against King John, led by a party known as the Northerners. Northern lords from Northumberland, from Cumberland, from Westmoreland, from Yorkshire, from Lancashire, who joined together in order to go against King John's rule. King John set out to impose his authority on the north of England in a way that his predecessors had not done. He was physically present in the north of England far more than any previous English king. He sought to raise money and impose royal government on an entirely new scale, and this was a major factor in the rebellion of 1214-1215 that led to the Northerners imposing Magna Carta. There was another major rebellion in the north of England in the 14th century, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, against King Edward II, that ended in 1322 at the Battle of Boroughbridge, when Thomas was captured by the king's forces and later put to death.
By the late 15th century, the House of Tudor now ruled England. Henry VIII, born in 1491 as the second son of Henry VII, would go down in history as one of England's greatest kings. But his rule was far from stable, as the North would once again test its rulers' patience to the full.
Henry was crowned King of England in 1509. His disagreement with Pope Clement VII over the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon led Henry to initiate the English Reformation, separating the Church of England from papal authority. The king appointed himself supreme head of the Church of England and dissolved convents and monasteries, for which he was excommunicated from the Vatican. This break from the Catholic Church caused widespread distress throughout England.
The Pope in Rome was no longer the sole spiritual authority of England. Catholicism, and a way of life that had been in place for over 1,000 years, was under threat.
For one large group of loyal Catholics, it was time to act. It all began on the 1st of October 1536 at St James Church, Louth in Lincolnshire. Led by a shoemaker called Nicholas Melton, several thousand people joined an uprising to protest against the closure and suppression of monasteries and parish churches, although not yet against the rule of Henry VIII himself. Here at this church, the Lincolnshire Rising, as it would come to be known, would be big and bloody, and Henry's response swift and brutal.
The rising in Louth quickly gained support in the nearby towns of Market Raisin, Castor and Horncastle, and trouble began to spread. Dr Raines, who was the Chancellor of the Diocese of Lincoln, was dragged from his sickbed in Bolingbroke and beaten to death. Important documents were burnt and seized by the rebels, and the gentry began to join the call for arms. The rebels began to number in their thousands, and together they marched to Lincoln to occupy the cathedral. And it's here that they drew up their articles, or their list of demands, which included things like being able to continue to worship in the Roman Catholic way. However, quite quickly, Henry VIII sent word that Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, was en route, and the rebels needed to disperse. By the 7th of October, Charles Brandon had arrived, and he managed to persuade the rebels to go home, promising that he would put their petition to the king. Henry was enraged, however, and we can see just how angry he was in the reply that he sent to the rebels, calling the county the most brute and beastly of the entire realm.
It just fizzled out like most Commons risings do, in a way. Without firm leadership from the top, it's very hard to sustain that sort of a spontaneous uprising.
The ringleaders, including the local vicar in Louth, were quickly executed, and the revolt was over. But the Lincolnshire Rising would stir the rage and passion of nearby Yorkshire and help inspire a more widespread rebellion against the king himself. It became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace.
There was a great deal of dissatisfaction in the north of England with the dissolution of the monasteries, the belief that they were going to be taxed for being baptised and married. There was a belief that 1 in 10 churches would be destroyed. And there was a real antagonism to the changes in the liturgy as well. People were used to chanting in Latin, and now they were being asked to do this in English. Purgatory was being abolished. Pilgrimages were being abolished. This was belief in the north. They were really upset at the idea of the gold and silver chalices going from their churches down to the south of England.
The recently issued 10 Articles and the New Order of Prayer were increasingly making doctrine more Protestant, which was incredibly alarming.
All of this was really against the beliefs of many in the north.
It was breaking down centuries of Catholic tradition in England.
And they felt really, really angry at these changes.
There were also widespread concerns among the general population about Henry's behaviour. Catherine of Aragon had died that year, and she had been a beloved queen of the people. Her replacement, Anne Boleyn, who was not so popular, had been beheaded on trumped-up charges of adultery and witchcraft. And Henry was now eagerly seeking his third wife, Jane Seymour. There was a general sense that England was tipping towards tyranny. Henry was passing laws that allowed him to levy taxes during peacetime, and it was now illegal for anyone to question Henry's position as head of the English Church.
People were torn between loyalty to the king on one hand and the loyalty to their consciences and their religion on the other.
At 5 o'clock on the evening of the 16th of October, 1536, Robert Aske, a barrister from London who now lived in Yorkshire, led 9,000 followers, each of whom had sworn the oath of the honourable men to enter and occupy York. Aske arranged for expelled monks and nuns to return to their houses. The king's newly installed tenants were driven out and Catholic observances were resumed. The pilgrimage of grace had begun.
Robert Aske was actually operating on a traditional system where ordinary people had risen up and presented petitions to their king.
Aske thought that there was a possibility of success.
He was looking back to previous rebellions, such as the one in 1525 against Wolsey's amicable grant,
where the government did actually make concessions and there wasn't great bloodshed afterwards.
He also felt that if he could put his point across to the king, he would be listened to and there would be room for negotiation.
Of course, he hadn't reckoned with the personality of Henry VIII, but of course he was to find that out later.
They rejected the term rebel and called themselves pilgrims, swearing an oath to Almighty God and wearing badges and carrying banners that depicted the 5 wounds that Christ suffered at his crucifixion.
The title that the rebels chose, the Pilgrimage of Grace for the Commonwealth, is quite interesting. It shows that they are clearly religiously motivated pilgrimage. It's not a rebellion, it's a pilgrimage. For the Commonwealth, shows that they are concerned with social issues as well. And so you've got this combination of the religious, they've got to put right what they think is wrong with Henry's religious reforms, with the political, let's put right the things that his government have put into place.
To spread their message, the rebels distributed leaflets and they also sang ballads, hoping to encourage more people to join their cause. The rebellion was supported by members of the gentry, some of whom joined willingly, others later claimed that they were forced to do so.
Robert Aske and his army then besieged and captured Pontefract Castle, recruiting its protector, Lord Darcy, although Darcy later claimed he was forced to join the rising.
By late October 1536, Aske had between 30 and 40,000 followers, and they marched south to Doncaster to meet a small royalist army. The stage was set for a confrontation.
Our country's population is about 2.5 or 3 million at this time. So that's a huge number of people. It's massive. It's the largest revolt, if you like, in English history. comparative to the size of the population. And so the Crown's dilemma is how to deal with this.
The Royalists, led by the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Shrewsbury, were greatly outnumbered. Upon seeing the vast rebel army, Norfolk negotiated and made promises to avoid being massacred. Promises he knew he couldn't keep.
The Duke of Norfolk is faced with a list of demands which the Pilgrims present to him. They make it very clear from the start that they're not against Henry VIII.
The list of demands really tackled the grievances that the rebels had.
They want, for example, an end to certain taxes, an end to the dissolution of the monasteries.
They wanted the king to get rid of his chief advisor, Cromwell.
They also wanted a reformation of how MPs were elected, showing real concerns about parliamentary representation, and they wanted a parliament to be held at York so the northern interest could be heard.
Now, Henry is not going to compromise, really. His status as a monarch is at stake here. And whilst, for example, in earlier years there'd been small compromises, this one is just a step too far.
Naively trusting Norfolk's promises, Aske dismissed his followers. But the king had not authorised the Duke of Norfolk to give these concessions, and Norfolk's enemies at court had told the king that the Duke could put down a rebellion of ordinary people if he wanted to, suggesting that Norfolk actually sympathised with the pilgrimage.
It's clear that Robert Aske does believe the promises made by Norfolk, and he is hoping that there will be future opportunities to discuss the rebel demands with the king.
Aske was invited to visit the king in London at Christmas, and the king met him with fair words, promising to forgive the rebels and gratify the North, jealous of the supremacy of the South, by holding a parliament at York.
I think Henry is playing a game right from the beginning. Realpolitik means he knows he needs to bide time to take the sting out of the rebellion.
Aske returned to York with these vague promises and continued to trust that Henry would fulfil the North's demands. His many followers, however, were becoming impatient, and it was clear Aske had lost the leverage he once had.
Henry VIII also made Robert Aske promise that the North would not rise again, that he would keep the peace in the north of England. Now, this was an impossible task. Robert couldn't do it because all the different areas in the north had risen for different reasons, with different individual leaders of the different hosts. So it was impossible for Robert to keep the peace.
People slowly do start to become quite restless when the pardons are not forthcoming and when the parliament that was promised for the north doesn't materialise.
In February 1537, Sir Francis Bigod led a new rising in Cumberland and Westmoreland, which had not been authorised by Robert Aske.
There were rumours that key locations in Hull and Scarborough were being fortified so that the gentry could use them to put the Commons down if they rose again. It was even suspected that the Mayor of York was going to force the people to put down their arms. Bigod really felt that Henry had betrayed the North.
The local rebels turned up at Barnard Castle, which was held by Robert Bowes. He didn't put up much of a fight, really. He looked outside, I think, of the castle and saw the masses of people outside and thought, this isn't going to work, I'm going to surrender, which he did. And indeed, he joined the rebels, as many gentry did at that time. And I think he did this in order to perhaps restrict the violence of the rising and try and control it a bit. So he kind of went along for the ride, but not necessarily particularly enthusiastic.
Henry VIII takes this as a sign that Robert's reneged on his promise to keep the peace in the north. And he also accuses Robert of communicating with the rebels in the north to raise rebellion. Robert has in actual fact been writing letters to other leaders saying, do not rise, keep the peace, and perhaps we'll get what we want from Henry.
The rebels failed to capture key locations across the north. There was a failed assault on Kingston upon Hull, and the rebel forces were defeated and captured at Beverley.
Henry, I think, has realised how tenuous his control of the north really was. That this rebellion could rise up under, as it were, his watch quite so quickly and get to such powerful presence, really. So in fact, he feels he needs then to very strongly reassert royal power in this part of the country.
This revolt provided King Henry with the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Vengeful, he wanted to punish the North for the Pilgrimage of Grace.
He sent the Duke of Norfolk to pacify the region. This was Norfolk's chance to prove his loyalty to the king, and he didn't waste it. 178 people were rounded up and executed.
Henry VIII was really furious at these rebellions in the north that had not been quietened down, and he is determined to seek vengeance. Many of the lords involved in the rebellion are enticed to London and are executed. The Abbot of Worley is hanged outside on the gates of his monastery. The Abbot of Sawley is taken down to London as well. Many men were also hung outside their villages for being involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Some managed to buy their pardons, but Henry was vicious in his suppression of the North.
Well over 200 people actually paid a pretty gruesome price for their involvement in the rebellion. None more so, of course, than Aske.
Robert Aske is taken down to the Tower of London in April 1537 and brought back up to the north of England, to York, on the 12th of July, on a market day, to get the most people seeing his humiliation. He is dragged through the streets of York on a hurdle and taken to Clifford's Tower, where he is tried. His own brother John is on the jury of lords who try him, and he is condemned to death. He is executed and his body hung in a gibbet from the walls of Clifford's Tower.
In a particularly cruel twist of fate, Aske was not hung with a noose of rope, as was customary, but with one made of chains, which caused an even more excruciating and prolonged death. Ironically, Aske had only dined with King Henry a few weeks earlier, and now his bones were left hanging in York for all to see.
The 16th day of May, there were arranged at Westminster afore the King's Commissioners Sir Robert Constable, Knight, Sir Thomas Percy, Knight, and brother to the Earl of Northumberland, Sir Francis Bygod, Knight. Robert Aske, gentleman, that was captain in the insurrection of the Northern men, all which persons were indicted of high treason against the king, and that day condemned by a jury of knights and esquires for the same, whereupon they had sentence to be drawn, hanged, and quartered. And on the 25th day of May, Abbot Quondam of Fountains and Dr Pickering, friar, were drawn from the Tower of London to Tyburn, and there hanged, bowled, and quartered, and their heads set on London Bridge and divers gates in London.
The reprisals were extensive. Hundreds of ordinary people were killed for their involvement in the rebellion.
The pilgrimage had failed. A northern rebellion crushed once more by a distant monarch. The rebels were either dead or imprisoned, but worse was to come for England's Catholics.
Henry's Reformation plans continued unabated and actually sped up in the years that followed. In 1539, he passed a second act for the dissolution of the greater monasteries.
In York itself, you had 4 monasteries, 4 friaries, and 90 chantries that are all dissolved.
By the time we get to 1540, nearly 900 religious houses had been closed. Cromwell began his attacks on the old elements of Catholicism that still remained, including statues and rood screens and images.
Protestant prayer books are imposed upon many parishes, and rosaries are gone.
Piece by piece, people's traditional way of life was being torn down.
Although Henry might negotiate on other things, for the leadership of the church, that was non-negotiable.
He was going to be the head of the Church of England, not the Pope.
The Pilgrimage of Grace really solidified the identity that the North had, and it showed how distinct the people of the North felt from their southern counterparts.
The way of life in the North changed forever.
They felt left out of parliamentary proceedings, of the way that laws were decided, and the new measures that Henry and his advisors were implementing.
Instead of the Northerners getting their wishes addressed by the king, they get a more vigorous, watchful royal authority controlling the region instead of the local landowners and the local nobility.
In 1539, the Council of the North was given a permanent home at King's Manor in York. This really represents the extension of Henry's power into the northern provinces, and also represents the centralisation of Tudor government.
In the next and final episode, we see how Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, is forced to confront rebels in the north who not only oppose her, but attempt to kill her.
This was their opportunity to put a stop to what the government was doing. After all, God was on their side.
This was a huge threat to the House of Tudor.
In the series so far, we've seen how the North rose up to rebel against the rule of William the Conqueror in 1069, and how he responded with a brutal harrying that ravaged the North and secured the Norman conquest of England. And we heard how Catholic Northerners, opposed to King Henry VIII's split from the Catholic Church in Rome, launched a huge rebellion that roused the fury of Henry and led to more bloody reprisals. In this final episode, we look at how Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, faced a threat from the north not only to her rule, but also to her life. This monarch would, like many before her, drive down hard on the rebels to secure her reign.
The northeastern city of Durham was, for many centuries, one of the most important places in England, and it played a pivotal role in the rebellions against both William the Conqueror and Queen Elizabeth I.
In 16th century England, Catholicism was under threat. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, began the English Reformation, breaking from the Catholic Church, dissolving the monasteries and forming the Church of England, of which he was the head. For many, especially in the north where Catholicism was still strong, Henry's affront to the Pope was sacrilege, and there were several attempts to oppose it. All failed, and the Church of England and the King maintained supremacy over religious affairs. When Henry died in 1547, his young son Edward became king at the age of 9, but died just 6 years later. Following Edward's last wishes, leading ministers then proclaimed his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as Queen in an effort to preserve the fledgling Church of England. But Lady Jane's cousin, Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, had a better claim to the throne. Moreover, Mary Tudor was a Catholic, and this gave many English Catholics the opportunity they needed to overthrow the Church of England and restore Catholicism.
Mary Tudor is a devout Catholic, And this does cause problems with her father, Henry VIII, who's made himself head of the Church of England and put England on the Protestant track. She wants to return the country to Catholicism and to reinstate the Pope as the head of the Church. Catholics in England really thought of Mary as a beacon of light to restore Catholicism. And they also objected to the fact that as the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, she had been denied her rights to succeed to the throne.
Within days of Jane's accession to the throne, Mary assembled a force in East Anglia and deposed Jane, who was later beheaded in the Tower of London.
Catholics now had a papist queen on the throne, and Mary did not let them down. She began a vigorous attempt to reverse the English Reformation initiated years earlier by her father, Henry VIII.
She did restore many Catholic nobles back to their positions of power in the north of England. The Earl of Northumberland, whose father had been involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, had lost his lands, and Mary reinstated his lands and put him in a position of power on the border with the Scots. And the same with Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland. She reinstated him to a position of power in the north of England.
To her Protestant opponents, she became known as Bloody Mary, and during her 5-year reign, over 280 religious dissenters were burned at the stake in the Marian persecutions. The English Church was once more under the control of the Pope, and hundreds of leading Protestants fled the country.
Mary was ruthless in her attempt to get rid of Protestantism and reimpose Catholicism on the country.
Our view of Mary Tudor is very much influenced by later Protestant propaganda. She tried to bring in a sort of counter-reformation to roll back the years to the church before Henry VIII. And part of that, of course, was burning heretics. But if 280 was bad, it was nothing compared to what would happen later.
The trials and burnings whipped up anti-Catholic feeling. Protestant victims became lauded as martyrs, and they longed for a new monarch to once again free England from the Catholic Church.
Their prayers were answered in 1558 with the death of Bloody Mary and the coronation of her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth I. With England bitterly divided between Catholics and Protestants, Elizabeth sought to end the religious turmoil. The Act of Supremacy of 1558 re-established the Church of England's independence from the Pope in Rome, and Parliament conferred on Elizabeth the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England. But Elizabeth did offer concessions to Catholics, allowing them some freedoms of worship and permission to use traditional priestly vestments.
When Elizabeth came to the throne, she said that she would not make windows into men's souls, that as long as they paid outward observance to her new Church of England, she would not persecute them. However, in the 1560s, she did begin to make people take oaths to the Protestant state.
Elizabeth's policy was clearly Protestant in theology, but in many other ways it was quite conservative. And so Catholics were a mixture of disappointed in the direction of religion, but also hopeful that actually Elizabeth might also be persuadable.
Elizabeth was always one for compromise, or perhaps always one for never really making a decision. So what you end up with quite often is what they called a via media, the middle way. And how this played out with the Church of England was that you had essentially a Protestant church, but there was enough in it that was of the old Catholic ways. So, for example, vestments, some aspects of the liturgy, and so on and so on. And actually, for most people, that was enough.
For a minority of Catholics, though, it wasn't enough. and the Elizabethan religious settlement failed to end the tensions.
In Durham and in Yorkshire, the bishops and archbishops started smashing Catholic statues. They started burning Catholic prayer books. The Bishop of Durham's wife, Catherine, actually burnt the ancient flag of St Cuthbert. The Bishop of Durham smashed up any old tombs with Catholic symbols on them as well. And this caused real resentment from the Catholics in the north of England. Under Mary, they'd had a glimmer of hope that Catholicism would be restored. Many of the lords that she'd put back in power, Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and the Earl of Northumberland, were demoted on the Scottish border by Elizabeth.
In the mid-16th century, neither side offered concessions to others. Religious violence was so strong on both sides, there was a huge kind of political uncertainty in many countries, and therefore a lot to play for.
And there were further problems for the new queen. Elizabeth's accession itself was also disputed due to the questioned legitimacy of the marriage of her parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's policy of centralisation, shifting powers from regional institutions to royal control, also caused friction on the northern border. Elizabeth's opponents now looked to Mary, Queen of Scots, a descendant of Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret. In the eyes of many Catholics, Elizabeth was illegitimate and Mary was the rightful Queen of England. Many English Catholics, still a significant portion of the population, saw Mary's claim as a way to restore Roman Catholicism. This position was particularly strong in the north of England, where several powerful nobles were Roman Catholics, and there'd been similar risings against Henry VIII in 1536 and 37. Elizabeth's policy of demoting Catholics and placing loyal Protestant men in positions of power in the north had created ill feeling and political instability. Mary's supporters hoped that Catholic France and Spain would aid their cause, whilst for Elizabeth, Mary's claim to her throne would be a constant thorn in the side. When Mary, Queen of Scots, crossed the border into England in May 1568, the north was a political and religious tinderbox ready to explode. Her arrival lit the fire of revolt.
Mary, Queen of Scots, had come into England in 1568. She'd taken refuge in the country after being overthrown in her own country. This meant, though, of course, that you had a Catholic queen, albeit in prison, under house arrest in England, but clearly, if you were a Catholic in the country and you wanted to replace Elizabeth, you didn't have to look too far to find an alternative.
From the minute she arrives, many Catholic nobles seek to free her from captivity and place her on the throne. She is the spark that lights the powder keg of the north into rebellion.
With a Catholic queen waiting in the wings, two powerful Catholics in the north decided to roll the dice.
Charles Neville, 6th Earl of Westmoreland, and Thomas Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, began the uprising on the 7th of November 1569.
The Earl of Northumberland and the Earl of Westmoreland were Catholics. Now, this meant that they weren't fully trusted, and so they were seeing their influence in the north of England being chipped away, where Elizabeth, following on from Henry's policy, is putting people in power up here that are much more about loyalty to Elizabeth.
And when they issued their proclamations of rebellion, they actually claimed that they were loyal servants of the Queen. Their only intention was to restore the rightful religion of England, Catholicism. Although there were dark hints that they had foreign support. They had sent letters to Philip II of Spain and the Pope to get their support. And it was rumoured that Spanish troops would land at Hartlepool in the north of England.
Westmoreland and Northumberland used rather traditional means to get their forces together. Essentially, they relied on their tenants. It meant that the number of forces they were able to get together was somewhat limited. Although the country in the north of England was still Catholic, and whilst, it wasn't what they wanted, most people felt that they could kind of live with it, and within it, they remained Catholic. It wasn't a popular religious rising in the same way, for example, that the Pilgrimage of Grace had been.
Several hundred knights were summoned to Brancepeth Castle. From there, the rebels took and occupied the city of Durham on the 14th of November.
When the rebels enter the city of Durham, they march into the cathedral.
They tear down all the Protestant things, the communion tables and what have you.
And all the Protestant books are burnt. They reinstate the altar.
And they have a good old Catholic Mass again, and they carry on having these Catholic Masses.
They take complete control of the city of Durham.
Durham was important because the Bishop of Durham was a prince bishop. They had a lot of authority. They had political authority as well as religious authority. They had weapons, they had a lot of money, etc. So if you controlled Durham, you really had a really good base from which to operate your rising. Elizabeth wants this rising put down, and she wants a very large army gathered to do it. She was determined that there should be no such rising again.
Durham had played a significant role in the rebellion against William the Conqueror. Now, 500 years on, rebels would use the city once again to challenge the ruling monarch.
The rebels marched south through Darlington and Northallerton, arriving in Ripon on the 20th of November and gathering 6,000 men. From there, they marched to Bramham Moor, hoping to muster more men to their cause and to decide what to do next. If their intention at this stage had been to free Mary Queen of Scots from captivity, they were thwarted by her removal from the north to Coventry on the 22nd of November. At first, Elizabeth struggled to raise forces sufficient to confront them, but hearing of a large force being raised by the Earl of Sussex, the rebels abandoned any plans to besiege York and, on the 24th of November, began their retreat northwards. On the 14th of December, they captured Barnard Castle, the stronghold of Elizabeth's loyal agent, George Bowes.
Barnard Castle found itself right in the centre of the rising of the Northern Earls. A large army of about 5,000 people turned up to besiege the castle. They had with them some guns, and they were actually able to get into the outer part of the castle. They were also able to cut off the water supply. But Sir George Bowes doesn't intend to give up without a fight. The problem for him is that an awful lot of his followers did want to give in without a fight. And we have a letter from him that he wrote later that says something along the lines of, "Last night, 65 of my followers jumped over the walls, of which 35 broke their arms, legs and backs in the leaping." So people are deserting him, and then to make matters worse, some of the guys in the castle decide we've had enough of this, and they open up the gates to the castle and they all rush out. It's about 150 of his followers just run away. Now, he's all set to sort of fight on, but the game's up, really. He's got no supplies, he's got no water. He surrenders the castle. But in many ways, his job's done, because the time that the rebels spent besieging the castle, 10, 11 days, gave the royal army a chance to get its act together. And by the time that the castle surrenders, they're coming up to the border with Durham.
Sussex marched out from York with a royalist army on the 13th of December. He had 10,000 men against the rebels' 6,000 and was followed by 12,000 men under Baron Clinton. 3 days later, on the 16th of December, the rebel earls abandoned their foot soldiers and fled north past Hexham and Alnwick. By the end of December, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland had crossed the border into Scotland.
The game was up for the Northern Earls. They hadn't managed to attract the support that they'd hoped. There was no foreign aid coming to assist them, and a large royal army was closing in on them. So they crossed the border essentially to escape the wrath of Elizabeth.
The rising was over. Elizabeth's retribution began. Northumberland was later captured by a Scottish earl and handed over to Elizabeth in 1572. She had him beheaded at York. Westmoreland fled to Flanders, where he died, impoverished.
Elizabeth needed to reassert her authority in the region. Again, she reinforced the powers of the Royal Council in that region to act strongly against local Catholic recidivist landowners, and she also needed to secure her border.
4 more rebel leaders were executed in York on the 20th of March, and 8 were executed at Tyburn on 27th of May. Of the 64 gentry condemned in York, most were allowed to live on condition that their lands were forfeited to the Crown. Of the rank and file foot soldiers, abandoned in the field by their lords, over 600 were chosen by lot to be hung outside their own villages. In Richmondshire, 1,241 had joined the rebellion and 231 were chosen to die.
To my officers, resist, repress, subdue, slay, kill, and put to execution of death by all ways and means.
Queen Elizabeth declared martial law and confiscated 1/3 of the property of all the common rebels. She exacted terrible retribution on the ordinary folk of the Yorkshire Dales, despite their limited support for the Earl's rising. The perpetrators of this purge were, as a contemporary account said, wholly of the meanest sort of people, so that hardly a village escaped the sight of a public hanging.
This is far worse, of course, than the number of people that were killed by Bloody Mary, or the number of people that were executed after the Pilgrimage of Grace. This is a piece of brutality, really, that quite often we forget about when we talk about Elizabeth. But when you think about it, Elizabeth's methods work. There isn't another great rising in the north of England. This was perhaps the medieval aristocracy's last hurrah, you could say.
In March 1570, 12,000 would-be rebels who had not marched with the Earls due to a lack of arms and armour bought pardons from the Queen. In County Durham alone, 4,311 men paid £3,260, equivalent to over £8 million today.
The end of the rebellion of the Earls was the kind of final fling of northern aristocratic rebellion against the centralising authority of government, and thereafter royal government in those regions was in the hands of trusted landowners and gentry. That effectively reduced opportunities for rebellion in that part of the country.
The Earls, though they were brave and bold, against so many could not stay. Thee Norton, with thine 8 good sons, they doomed to die, alas for Ruth. Thy reverend locks thee could not save, nor them fair and blooming youth. With them full many a gallant wight, they cruelly bereaved of life, and many a child made fatherless, and widowed many a tender wife.
The Pope, too late to support the Earls, declared Elizabeth illegitimate in 1570 and released her subjects from obedience to her. Elizabeth now had even more reason to view Catholics with suspicion, and indeed several more conspiracies threatened her life. Some of them were proven to be connected to Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth had her executed in 1587.
Elizabeth was skillful in her management of the difficulties of politics around her person and around her regime. And when she was convinced of the need to act vigorously, if you like, and quite brutally in some cases, she could do so. But that was quite a difficult thing for her to do. If you think of Mary, Queen of Scots, she was being pushed to execute her for a long time, by the more advanced and aggressive Protestants, but she hung back and hung back because Mary was a queen, and she always felt that if she executes a queen, then actually she gives carte blanche to others to do the same.
25 years after the Northern Rebellion would see a number of plots against Elizabeth, primarily aiming to replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. She managed to, of course, survive them all. The last one, 1586, was Mary Queen of Scots' downfall because she made the mistake of getting involved in correspondence with the plotters, and that correspondence was intercepted by the government. And that gave those people at court that felt that Mary Queen of Scots needed to be executed the opportunity to present that to Queen Elizabeth.
But the Rising of the North, also known as the Revolt of the Northern Earls, and all subsequent attempts to remove Elizabeth from the throne, failed. She lived on until the age of 69, dying in 1603, and is remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs, reigning over a golden age of progress.
At a time when wars and seditions, with grievous persecutions, have vexed almost all kings and countries round about me, my reign hath been peaceable, and my realm a receptacle to thy afflicted church. The love of my people hath appeared firm, and the devices of my enemies frustrate.
Yet her 45 years on the throne were also mired in controversy. Ruthless military tactics in Ireland stain her record, and she offered very limited aid to foreign Protestants in their struggle against Catholic powers like Spain.
Many saw the brutal repression of the 1569 Rising as one of a series of disasters inflicted on the North by the South. In this series, we've looked at 3 of the major uprisings initiated by Northern people unhappy with rule from the South.
Ever since Roman times, the North has been poorer and less developed than the wealthier South. By almost every social and economic measure, from GDP to wealth, health, life expectancy and literacy, the North has fallen behind its southern neighbours. Even during the Industrial Revolution, when the great cities of Manchester, Liverpool and Leeds were the manufacturing centres of the world, much of the money flowed south, and the North, less developed and less well-funded than the South, never gained the sort of political power that provincial states acquired in other countries.
Despite its economic inferiority, or perhaps because of it, the North has found other ways to expedite the talent and acumen of its people. It has been through culture, from music and television to art and sport, that the North has cultivated its reputation for excellence. Punching far above their size, places like Manchester and Liverpool have become world-renowned for their cultural exports, particularly music and football.
So whilst history may have conspired to hold back the North, today the fiery, independent spirit, the grit, determination and unique character of Northerners, distinct in their identity, culture and accent from the South, is helping to shape a new North. A North whose cities, culture, academic institutions, stunning landscapes and sporting prowess are world-renowned. A North that is proudly English, yet also proudly Northern.
And a North that's looking forward, not backwards. Perhaps that's why so few people in the North know much about the Northern Rebellions and why these events are not really part of the collective consciousness. Because it's all in the past, long forgotten. But then again, the Northern sense of itself, its distinctiveness from the South, has evolved over the last 2 millennia, and perhaps the rebellions and subsequent suppression has contributed to that identity.
Hopefully, the North may never need to rebel again. But if history teaches us anything, it teaches that those in power should heed the warnings of the past and not dominate or hold back a proud, independent people. The Northern Rebellions serve as a reminder to the political elite to never take the North's obedience for granted.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.